You've heard the story 1,000 times. Ancient humans were lean, chiseled, constantly moving, constantly hungry, running down animals across open grassland with almost no body fat to spare. It's practically the founding myth of every fitness influencer on the internet. Eat like a caveman, move like a caveman, get lean like a caveman. And underneath that myth is an assumption so obvious that nobody bothers to question it. Obesity is a modern problem, a product of fast food, screens, and a world where you don't have to walk 10 kilometers to eat dinner. So here's a question that sounds simple and isn't. Could an ancient human have actually been fat, not soft, not a little padded, genuinely, medically obese? And if the answer is yes, what does that do to the story you've been told your entire life about your own body? Here's why this question actually matters, beyond simple curiosity. Right now, more than 1 billion people on the planet are classified as living with obesity, and the number keeps climbing every single year in almost every country on Earth that has access to modern food supply chains. Governments call it an epidemic, doctors call it a crisis, and almost everyone, quietly or not so quietly, treats it as a personal failure, a sign that someone simply isn't disciplined enough to resist temptation the way their ancestors supposedly did. But what if that entire framing is built on a myth? What if the real story isn't about weakness at all, but about a body doing precisely what it evolved to do, in an environment that no longer makes any sense to it? Let's start with the honest, unglamorous math, because it explains almost everything that follows. A hunter-gatherer burning calories through walking, digging, climbing, carrying, and hunting needed a huge amount of energy just to stay alive. Estimates for daily energy expenditure in traditional foraging societies run consistently high, often comparable to or even exceeding the energy output of a modern endurance athlete on an average day. And food, for almost the entire span of human history, was not guaranteed. There was no refrigerator, no stockpile that couldn't spoil, rot, get stolen, or get eaten by something else first. Calories in were unpredictable. Calories out were relentless. For the vast majority of ordinary people living this way, sustained obesity would have been close to a physical impossibility. You simply could not eat enough, consistently enough, to outpace what your body was burning just to survive the day. That's the part almost everyone gets right. Where it gets more complicated and considerably darker is what happens at the edges of that system. Because human history is not one long uniform stretch of lean hunter-gatherers. It's tens of thousands of years, dozens of different subsistence strategies, radically different environments, and, crucially, radically different levels of access to food within any given group. And whenever access to food stopped being equal, something interesting starts showing up in the archaeological and artistic record. Let's go back roughly 25,000 to 30,000 years, to a category of small carved figurines found across Ice Age Europe, from France to Russia. Archaeologists call them Venus figurines. You've probably seen at least one photograph of the most famous example, the Venus of Willendorf, discovered in Austria in 1908. She is small, roughly 11 centimeters tall, carved from limestone, and her body is striking. Wide hips, large, heavy breasts, a rounded, prominent stomach. No face to speak of, just tightly detailed hair or a woven cap covering the head. For over a century, archaeologists have argued about what she actually represents. A fertility symbol, a goddess, a self-portrait carved by a woman looking down at her own body, which would explain the strange, foreshortened proportions. Or, and this is the theory that matters most for our question, a surprisingly literal record of what a well-fed human body actually looked like to the artist who carved it. Here's what makes that last theory harder to dismiss than you might expect. The Venus of Willendorf is not an isolated case. Similar figurines, with similar proportions, wide hips, rounded stomachs, heavy thighs, have been found at dozens of sites spanning thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. The Venus of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, the Venus of Lausel in France, holding what appears to be a carved bison horn. The Venus of Kostenki in Russia, different cultures, different toolkits, different eras of the Ice Age, and yet a recurring visual language built around exactly the kind of body that, statistically, almost nobody in that era should have been able to have. So what is actually going on? One increasingly discussed hypothesis, put forward by researchers studying the geographic spread of these figurines, is that the body types depicted correlate with how difficult survival was in a given region during the depths of the last glacial maximum, in the harshest, coldest, most food-insecure environments. Close to the edges of the ice sheets, the figurines tend to be the most exaggerated, the widest hips, the heaviest stored fat. The theory goes like this. In an environment defined by brutal, unpredictable famine, the ability to store body fat wasn't a health risk. It was quite literally the difference between a woman surviving pregnancy and lactation, or not. A body capable of accumulating and holding on to substantial fat reserves during good months would have been the single most reproductively successful body type available during an actual famine. These carvings, under this theory, aren't idealized fantasy bodies. or exaggerated fertility symbols in the vague sense everyone assumes. They may be a kind of visual worship of a specific, rare, and genuinely life-saving physical trait. Not obesity as we think of it today, a disease of abundance, but the ancient equivalent of an insurance policy, carved in stone, at a time when almost nobody could reliably afford one. That reframes the entire question, doesn't it? If this theory holds, ancient humans didn't fear body fat the way modern culture obsesses over it. They venerated it precisely because it was so rare and so valuable. But carvings are art, not biology. So let's look at what the bones themselves can actually tell us, because this is where the evidence gets genuinely strange. Adipose tissue, body fat itself, does not fossilize. It rots away long before bone does, which means archaeologists can't simply measure ancient body fat percentages the way a modern doctor would. But obesity leaves other fingerprints on the human skeleton, indirect but detectable signatures that persist for thousands of years. One of the clearest is a condition called diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, usually abbreviated DISH. It's a condition where ligaments along the spine gradually calcify and fuse, and in the modern world it's strongly associated with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. Crucially, DISH is something researchers can actually identify directly on ancient skeletal remains because it physically alters the bone itself. And DISH shows up in the archaeological record far more often than the lean, hard-scrabble image of prehistoric life would predict. Studies of skeletal populations from ancient Egypt have identified DISH in a meaningful percentage of mummified remains, particularly among individuals buried with markers of higher social status. Studies of medieval and early modern skeletal populations across Europe show the same pattern repeating, DISH clustering disproportionately among individuals whose burial context, grave goods, or location within a cemetery suggests they were wealthier, better fed, and almost certainly less physically active than the general population around them. In other words, wherever archaeologists find clear evidence of unequal access to food, they also tend to find the skeletal signatures of obesity riding right alongside it. The correlation is consistent enough that many researchers now treat DISH as one of the more reliable proxies available for reconstructing patterns of wealth, status, and dietary excess in ancient populations. Which brings us to Egypt specifically, because Egypt gives us something almost no other ancient civilization can offer at this kind of resolution: actual preserved soft tissue. Modern medical imaging of Egyptian mummies, using CT scans that don't require unwrapping or damaging the remains, has produced findings that genuinely surprise the researchers involved. A landmark study scanning dozens of mummies across multiple museum collections found clear evidence of atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of arteries usually associated with high-fat, high-calorie modern diets and sedentary lifestyles, in a substantial proportion of the individuals examined. These weren't isolated freak cases. They were priests, nobles, and members of the royal court, exactly the population you'd expect to have had reliable, abundant, calorie-dense access to bread, beer, and meat, in a society where the vast majority of the population lived on the edge of subsistence farming. Egyptian art itself, when you actually look closely rather than defaulting to the idealized, athletic pharaoh imagery most people picture, occasionally breaks from that idealized convention entirely. There are tomb paintings and carved reliefs depicting servants, musicians, and even certain officials with visibly rounded bellies and heavy limbs, rendered with what looks like deliberate, almost comedic specificity rather than artistic error. Egyptologists have long debated whether some of these images were meant to signal prosperity and status in a positive light, or whether they occasionally verged into caricature, mocking excess the same way a modern cartoonist might exaggerate a wealthy character's waistline. Either reading tells you the same underlying thing. The ancient Egyptians were visually and culturally aware of obesity as a real, recognizable condition, one closely tied to wealth, status, and a lifestyle unavailable to almost everyone around them. This is where the thread connecting all of this together starts to become impossible to ignore. Fat, throughout almost the entirety of human history, was not a mark of shame, it was a mark of success. Look beyond Egypt, and the pattern holds with almost eerie consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other whatsoever. In numerous Pacific Island societies, including parts of Polynesia, a large, substantial body was historically associated directly with chiefly authority, health, fertility, and the capacity to command resources. Ethnographic accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries repeatedly describe practices in some island cultures where individuals of high status, sometimes specifically young women or chiefs in training, were deliberately fed rich, calorie-dense diets and kept from strenuous physical activity for extended periods specifically to increase their body size. because a larger body was a direct, visible signal of the community's wealth and the individual's elevated standing. The logic was blunt and completely rational given the environment. In a world where food insecurity was the baseline condition of nearly everyone, a visibly large body was proof, worn directly on the person, that you or your family controlled enough surplus to never worry about famine. You see versions of the exact same logic independently across an enormous range of historical societies. Renaissance European portraiture repeatedly depicts wealthy merchants, nobles, and clergy with soft, rounded bodies rendered with obvious pride rather than embarrassment, because thinness at that point in history, for most of the population, signaled poverty, illness, or manual labor, not discipline. Historical Ottoman and Persian court art shows similar patterns among elite men and women. In numerous West African cultures, including well-documented practices among the Efik people of what's now Nigeria, there existed dedicated fattening rooms, where young women approaching marriage were secluded and deliberately fed to increase their body size before the wedding, because a fuller body directly signaled the family's prosperity and the woman's readiness and desirability as a wife. This wasn't an isolated curiosity. It was a formalized cultural institution, and in some communities descended from these traditions. Adapted versions of the practice persisted well into the 20th century. Think about how completely backwards that is from the picture in your head right now. For the overwhelming majority of human history, across cultures that never once communicated with each other, thinness was the thing people were quietly, sometimes desperately, trying to avoid. So if that's true, why does the opposite feel so obviously, self-evidently correct to you? Why did you grow up assuming lean equals healthy equals ancestral equals natural? Here's the uncomfortable answer. That assumption isn't ancient wisdom. It's an extremely recent cultural invention, and understanding exactly how recent it is matters enormously to the rest of this story. For almost the entire history of agriculture, right up through the Industrial Revolution and well into the 20th century in most of the world, calorie scarcity remained the default human condition for the vast majority of the population. Thinness, for most ordinary people, wasn't a lifestyle choice signaling discipline. It was simply what happened to bodies that didn't have enough to eat, combined with grueling physical labor in fields, mines, and factories. The people who escaped that reality, who could afford to eat well and avoid backbreaking labor, were, almost by definition, a tiny wealthy minority. And across culture after culture, that minority's bodies became the visible, celebrated proof of their status. It's the same underlying wealth signal we've already seen elsewhere: gold jewelry, rare trade goods, elaborate burial rites, except this time the signal was carved directly into flesh instead of gold or ivory. The reversal, the moment thinness flipped from a symbol of poverty into a symbol of discipline and status, is a startlingly recent phenomenon, tightly linked to industrialization and, later, mass food abundance. Once calorie-dense food became cheap, reliable, and available to nearly everyone in industrialized nations, roughly across the 20th century, being able to afford abundant food stopped being rare or impressive. What became genuinely rare, and therefore newly prestigious, was the ability to resist that abundance. Access to personal trainers, nutritionists, leisure time for exercise, and the food security required to be selective rather than desperate about what you eat. In other words, the exact same underlying logic that made ancient elites proudly fat simply flipped its polarity once food scarcity stopped being the default human condition for the wealthy. The status marker didn't disappear, it just switched sides. Now let's connect this all the way back to your own body, because this is where the real leftover instinct in this story lives. And it's not really about fat storage as a status symbol at all. It's about something running much deeper in your biology. In 1962, a geneticist named James Neal proposed an idea that has since become one of the most influential and most debated concepts in evolutionary medicine. He called it the Thrifty gene hypothesis. The core idea is straightforward. For most of human evolutionary history, our ancestors experienced repeated, unpredictable cycles of feast and famine, periods of relative abundance, followed by periods of serious, sometimes lethal, food scarcity. Under those conditions, natural selection would have strongly favored any genetic variant that made the body exceptionally efficient at storing fat during the good times, because that stored fat was quite literally a survival buffer against the bad times that were guaranteed to come eventually. Bodies that burned through calories quickly and stored almost nothing extra were bodies that starved to death the first time a drought, a failed hunt, or a brutal winter hit. Bodies that aggressively converted surplus calories into stored fat were the bodies that survived long enough to pass those same genes forward. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this created a population-wide bias, deeply encoded into human metabolism, favoring extremely efficient fat storage and a strong psychological drive to seek out calorie-dense food whenever it was available, because you genuinely never knew when the next famine was coming. And then, within the span of roughly 1 or 2 human lifetimes, in large parts of the modern world, the famine side of that equation essentially vanished. Calorie-dense food became not just available, but cheap, engineered for maximum palatability, and accessible 24 hours a day without requiring a single calorie of physical effort to obtain. The ancient thrifty genes didn't go anywhere. They're still running the exact same program they always did, aggressively storing surplus energy and driving intense cravings for fat and sugar, because as far as your underlying biology is concerned, there might be a famine coming next winter. Your body has absolutely no internal mechanism capable of understanding that the famine, for most people reading this, in most of the modern world, simply isn't coming anymore. This is the leftover instinct at the center of the entire obesity epidemic, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes something that gets treated as a purely moral failing in modern culture. That intense, sometimes overwhelming craving for sugar, fat, and calorie-dense food isn't a personal weakness or a lack of willpower. It's a multi-100,000-year-old survival mechanism, one that kept your specific ancestors alive through famines that killed the people around them who didn't have it, now firing in an environment engineered almost perfectly to exploit it. The modern food industry, whether or not it set out to do this deliberately, has become extraordinarily good at triggering exactly the ancient reward circuitry that once meant the difference between surviving winter and not. It's worth being honest, though, that the thrifty gene hypothesis isn't universally accepted among researchers, and the disagreement itself tells you something valuable about how messy this science actually is. One of the strongest challenges comes from the biologist John Speakman, who pointed out a real problem with Neil's original logic. If thrifty genes provided such a massive survival advantage during famines, you'd expect natural selection to have driven them to near-universal frequency across almost every human population on Earth relatively quickly. But that's not quite what the genetic evidence shows. Speakman proposed an alternative explanation instead, sometimes called the Drifty gene hypothesis. In his version, humans didn't specifically evolve strong fat storage genes because famine selected for them directly. Instead, once our ancestors got large enough and socially organized enough to mostly escape being hunted by large predators, the evolutionary pressure that had previously kept body weight tightly regulated within a narrow, lean range simply relaxed. Without predators picking off the heavier, slower individuals in a group, genetic variation in fat storage was free to drift in ways it never could before, essentially by neutral chance rather than active selection for thriftiness itself. Under this theory, humans don't have unusually strong thrifty genes so much as unusually loose ones, no longer actively kept in check by anything that used to matter. Both theories, thrifty and drifty, land in roughly the same place for our purposes here, even though they disagree about the exact mechanism. Whether your ancestors' fat storage biology was actively selected for during famines or simply left unchecked once predation pressure eased, the practical result sitting in your body right now is the same. A metabolism that is, by modern standards, remarkably good at storing surplus energy and remarkably unbothered about doing so, operating inside a food environment that bears almost no resemblance to the one that produced it, whichever evolutionary path actually got it there. The pattern doesn't stop with Egypt and the Pacific either. Look at classical Rome, and you find written accounts, not just art, explicitly describing obesity among the wealthy as both a status symbol and, eventually, a subject of moral panic. Roman writers like Seneca and Juvenal complained bitterly about the gluttony of the elite, describing multi-course banquets that stretched on for hours, foods imported at enormous expense specifically to be as rich and calorie-dense as possible, and even, according to some accounts, dedicated rooms where wealthy diners could vomit mid-feast simply to make room for more food. Whether every detail of that particular claim is historically accurate or somewhat exaggerated by moralizing critics, the underlying reality it points to isn't in serious dispute. Rome's aristocracy had access to a caloric abundance that the overwhelming majority of the empire's population could never have dreamed of, and their bodies, along with their reputations, reflected exactly that gap. So back to the original question, were ancient humans ever obese? The honest answer is layered, and it's more interesting than a simple yes or no. For the overwhelming majority of ordinary people living as hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers, sustained obesity was almost certainly close to physically impossible, simply because the caloric math never allowed for it. But the moment you introduce unequal access to food, whether through elite status in a stratified society, deliberate cultural practices designed to enlarge specific bodies, or, in the deep Ice Age past, perhaps even a kind of reverence for the rare individuals whose bodies could survive famine better than everyone else's, obesity appears again and again throughout human history, and it's consistently treated not as a defect, but as a mark of success, fertility, and survival. What changed isn't human biology. Your thrifty genes are, as far as anyone can tell, essentially identical to the genes carried by the people who carved the Venus of Willendorf 25,000 years ago. What changed is the environment those genes are now operating inside. For most of human history, The ancient instinct to crave and store calories was a hero, quietly keeping people alive through famines that would otherwise have wiped them out. It's only in the last handful of decades, in a world of cheap, engineered, calorie-dense food available around the clock, that the exact same instinct became something closer to a liability, working against the very body it evolved to protect. You didn't choose to crave the things you crave. Neither did the elites of ancient Egypt, and neither did the artist who carved a wide-hipped figure into limestone 25,000 years ago, working from the same basic biological logic running quietly underneath your own instincts right now. The instinct is ancient, the abundance is brand new, and the gap between those two facts, more than any individual's willpower or discipline, is where most of the modern struggle with weight actually begins.